to hear from you right now.
Okay. So we've been reading the Obesity Code by Dr. Jason Fung, and the 9th chapter was entitled The Carbohydrate Insulin Hypothesis. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of highlight for you some things that I thought was interesting and things that if you were reading would stand out to you as well, hopefully. And so we know through our reading of the author's text that insulin does cause obesity. But the questions still remain, what are the foods that cause our insulin levels to rise or spike? Refined carbs, highly refined carbs and sugars. These two help increase, these two can help increase and result in high insulin levels that leads us to weight gain and obesity. This is known also as, this is known as to, this is also known to us as the chapter that we just mentioned, the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, which has helped educate us by conducting studies in this chapter. And one man is highlighted in this chapter, which is Dr. Robert Atkins, that I'm sure most of you all have heard of or have maybe even tried his diet. This story, the story behind that is where he discovered a diet when he needed to lose weight. He was a heavy man, 224 pounds, and also in the early stages of his cardiology practice in New York City. And like others back in 1963, he tried basic ways to lose weight, but it was to no avail. So he back then, he referred back to many literatures and publishings that where they tried the low carb approach. And this meant that they didn't have to count calories like the caloric reduction theory that we've been talking about in the past chapters and with the other doctors. And so the health professionals and other professionals that recommended that. So this Dr. Atkins became an overnight sensation, and his work was published, and the book was called The Atkins Diet Revolution, which in 1972, he appeared on the Tonight Show. So he got a lot of recognition and people started picking up on what they thought was this new phenomenon, which in fact, it wasn't anything new, but it was just highlighted for everyone. And he made it popular because he was so heavy and he used his diet, this diet that other doctors had done a lot of research on to show the world that, you know, he could lose the weight. And so it did result with him severely restricting carbs. He lost a lot of weight. And so there were critics that continued to do studies to try to prove him wrong. But, you know, to the tune of 26 million people claimed that they were using that some type of diet that was based upon low carb foods. So, so it was noted that the possibility of solving health complications seemed to be near. So the American Heart Association for over 40 years advised a low-fat diet, and the communities of obesity grew tremendous. And then other doctors, they were doing the blame game, telling clients that it was their fault that they weren't losing weight and they weren't following the diet, and that was the low-fat diet. So they were still pushing that, but then it seemed that the low-carb diet was seemed to be reducing the appetite of many, and that led to people wondering, well, not wondering, researchers pointing out that it was more hormonal. It wasn't something that we could all control. And what was really interesting to me is that, and I think all of you all can attest to this, maybe since you all, you know, we're on this journey together, that when you eat foods like when you eat refined sugars and carbs, it makes you feel hungry. You think you can still have a dessert. But when you eat foods like apples and spinach and, you know, and even fish, they even say, you aren't hungry and craving more spinach. I mean, I don't know how many of us eat spinach and then we're craving for more. So it made sense. And so what it is they're saying it's some hormonal trigger. And they talk a lot about the scientific parts that you can go back and read, but it points out that hormonally we get this trigger when we eat sugars that we have more space. But that's because the processed foods do that. And Moselle talked to us about this early beginning that we would learn more about this. So when I started reading, I had my aha moment and I was like, wow, this is what she was talking about. So when we eat those refined sugars and carbs, they make us think we have more space because it's sending unnatural signals. But when we eat healthy foods, such as like, I mentioned before, spinach, the right kinds of vegetables and fruit, then our brains get the natural triggers. And that was the pivotal point for me when I was reading this, that refined foods can become addictive, and they make us overeat. And so that is so refined foods are not natural foods, and they're highly processed, and their toxicity is within the processing. So that is and so the last part of this chapter, the 9th chapter, it said that the driver, that the notion that carbs is the only driver of insulin is incorrect. There's still something missing. And they mentioned that sugar plays a major role in obesity. And how? And it's the missing part. And so the missing part is insulin resistance. So chapter 10 starts talking about insulin resistance being another major player. So we start to see that, that sugar and carbs, and then that plays a major role. So we move on to understanding more about insulin resistance, which leads to high insulin levels. And so there have been studies done and clues that look into our biological systems. And then they found that there were biological resistance. And so they gave an interesting example about antibiotics so that we can understand what that means about resistance. When we get antibiotics, you notice that they'll say, well, you're going to have to move to something else because you built up a resistance to that. Well, it talked about how that's the kind of same idea about insulin resistance. And so they went on to give another example about cocaine use, that when you first, and this one was a little bit easier for me to understand, and maybe for yourself, that when you use cocaine, and we, of course, we've never used drugs, but if you were to use a drug, then you would get initial high, and the next time it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be as intense. And so through exposure to that drug, they give example that the body starts to build a resistance to the drug, and that is called a tolerance. So people can build up a tolerance to narcotics, marijuana, nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol. And so they were just trying to explain how, how when you have when you have sugar that builds up naturally, then you build a resistance. And so then it's not just a one issue to solve, like how do you stop eating foods or do more exercise to help that, to minimize obesity or fight that. There has to be something else that has to be done. So then they go on to talk about the dependence of obesity and how insulin causes insulin resistance, and it causes high insulin. So this becomes a vicious cycle. And so this was interesting to learn that, for me, that that once you have high insulin in your system because of obesity, because you're now obese, that it's a cycle, and it continues, and they mention how you see fat people that are fat and then they continue to get fatter. Well, it's because they're going through a cycle, and they're ignoring the fact that time has happened. And when you have time that you've been, being fat for so long, you just can't come and intervene and think that you can, maybe do exercise or change your diet, and that will make a huge change, and that it has to be something more than that. So it says the obesity drives itself, and it suggests that long-standing obesity cycle is extremely difficult to break. And that is where we learn that diet alone may not be sufficient. So I'll end with that because that was a whole lot. And I know Moselle will probably be able to help sum up that chapter and make it blend well, but it was a lot to digest in that chapter 10 because that was a lot of science. And so that was my way of just trying to pull out some of the examples to share with you about insulin resistance in chapter 10.
That is excellent. Let's give her a hand, everybody.
That was a lot. Thank you.
That is beautiful. And when she makes it sound so simple and easy because she's given us